The Grumman F-14 Tomcat is a supersonic, carrier-based fighter and the first of the teen series of aircraft, which was followed by the F-15, F-16, and F-18. The Tomcat is also widely regarded as the first fourth-generation fighter and is a result of lessons learned from the Vietnam War. Initially intended as a naval air-to-air fleet defender, the F-14 also eventually served in aerial reconnaissance roles and as a precision ground attack platform. Notable features of the F-14 include variable swept wings which automatically adjust to flight conditions or can be manually controlled, twin engines and tails, a two-man crew, and the use of the AIM-54 Phoenix missile. Although retired from the US Navy's inventory in 2006, the Tomcat has gone on to become a favorite of aviation enthusiasts globally and was showcased in several movies, which brought it worldwide mainstream attention. Loved by many and feared by its adversaries, the F-14 is an iconic aircraft that has an unforgettable appearance and represents a revolutionary leap in fighter aircraft design. Let's take a look at some specifications of the final production version of the Tomcat, the F-14D. Length: 62 feet 9 inches. Height: 16 feet. Wingspan: 64 feet 1.5 inches unswept, or 38 feet 2.5 inches swept. Empty weight: 47,735 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight: 74,350 pounds. Maximum speed Mach 2.34. Range: 1,600 nautical miles. Combat range: 500 nautical miles. Engines: each General Electric F-110 GE400 produces 13,800 pounds of thrust dry, or 23,400 pounds thrust with afterburner. The F-14 is armed with the internal M61A1 Vulcan 20mm Gatling cannon, which is capable of firing 6,000 rounds a minute. An internal ammunition drum holds 675 rounds. Since the gun was placed on the left side of the F-14, the iconic Tomcat logo shows the cat with a 6-shooter on its left hip. Additionally, the F-14 has 10 hardpoints, 6 under the fuselage, 2 under nacelles, and 2 under wing gloves. These hardpoints have a combined capacity of 14,500 pounds of ordnance and fuel tanks. Weapon options for the Tomcat can include, for air-to-air missions, the short-range heat-seeking AIM-9 Sidewinder, the medium-range AIM-7 Sparrow, or the long-range AIM-54 Phoenix. Some of you may be wondering about the AIM-7 Sparrow's successor, the AIM-120 AMRAAM. It turns out the AIM-120 was considered and even tested for the F-14, but it was determined too costly to integrate the AIM-120 into the fleet F-14s. For air-to-ground missions, LAU-10 rocket pods, the Mark 80 series of unguided bombs, Mark 20 Rockeye 2 cluster bombs, the Paveway series of laser-guided bombs, or JDAM precision-guided bombs. Other loadout options can include 2 267-gallon external fuel tanks, the AN/AAQ-14 Lantern targeting pod, and the Tactical Airborne Reconnaissance Pod System, or TARPS, for photo reconnaissance operations. Initially, the F-14 made use of the AN/AWG-9 X-band radar, which was incredibly advanced for its time. The AWG-9 could track up to 24 targets and engage 6 simultaneously, while also making use of several tracking modes, including the first use of track while scan, along with range while search, pulse Doppler single target track, and jam angle track. This allowed the F-14 to track and lock not only fighters and bombers, but even inbound cruise missiles. Later versions of the F-14, designated F-14D, were upgraded to the APG-71 radar, the same radar found on the initial F-15 Strike Eagles. The APG-71 had a 230-mile range, and by using the F-14D's data link, 2 or more F-14Ds could operate the APG-71 at its theoretical maximum range of 460 miles. F-14s also featured radar warning receivers, electronic countermeasures, and a highly precise internal navigation system. And finally, the F-14 also made use of Northrop's AAX-1 or TCS for TV camera set. The TCS allowed pilots to visually identify and track aircraft up to 60 miles away. Additionally, the TCS was linked to the radar, allowing for visual identification and target tracking simultaneously. During the late 1950s, in order to counter Soviet long-range anti-ship missiles, which could be fired from jet bombers and submarines, the US Navy began looking for a long-range interceptor to defend its carrier battle groups. The idea became known as Fleet Air Defense and envisioned an aircraft with a more powerful radar and longer-range missiles than the F-4 Phantom. The new aircraft would intercept bombers and missiles at ranges before they could threaten the carrier battle group. In 1961, newly appointed Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara directed the Navy to join the Air Force Tactical Fighter Experimental or TFX program. TFX was intended to provide one solution for both services and would feature a twin-engine supersonic two-seat variable geometry wing aircraft. This led to the General Dynamics F-111, a large interdictor fighter bomber and strategic bomber which, while deployed by the Air Force and placed into production, did not meet the Navy's requirements. Grumman, who had been brought in by General Dynamics to help build the navalized F-111B version, began working on alternative designs that would optimize the F-111 for carrier operations. By 1966, the Navy awarded Grumman a contract to pursue advanced fighter designs. After reviewing several internal candidates, Grumman chose its 303 design as its frontrunner. The 303 design carried over the AN/AWG-9 radar and AIM-54 missile from the F-111B. After several iterations, the 303 design aircraft was designated F-14 and given the nickname Tomcat, after both a tribute to and a reflection of Admiral Thomas Connolly's involvement in the project. In fact, internally Grumman had been referring to the airplane as Tom's Cat. This naming convention also followed the Grumman tradition of feline names for their fighters, such as Wildcat, Hellcat, Tiger Cat, Panther, and Cougar. In July of 1968, the Navy issued a request for proposals for the Naval Fighter Experimental or VFX program. The requirements called for a Mach 2.2 tandem seat fighter, which would equip the M61 Vulcan cannon and make use of the AIM-54 Phoenix missile. 6 manufacturers submitted bids, and in 1969, Grumman was awarded the contract. In December of 1970, just 22 months after being awarded the contract, the F-14 took its first flight. The initial version of the F-14, the F-14A, made use of the F-111B's Pratt & Whitney TF-30 engines, and although the F-14A was lighter than the F-111B, the F-14 was still the heaviest and largest fighter to fly from a carrier, and as such the TF-30s were still underpowered for the F-14. Additionally, the TF-30 engines were prone to compressor stalls at high angles of attack with rapid throttle changes. This was problematic because rapid pitch and throttle changes were common in air-to-air combat maneuvers, and as a result, many compressor stalls were experienced in testing and development, not to mention the danger being ever present for fleet F-14As. The problem was made worse due to the F-14's widely spaced engines. If one engine stalled, the other still running engine would produce asymmetric thrust, which could place the Tomcat in an inverted or flat spin, making recovery difficult and sometimes impossible. The TF-30 engines were eventually replaced with General Electric F-110 GE400s. These new engines were so powerful that along with improved climb rate and range, in certain configurations Tomcats could take off from carriers without using afterburner. Initial Tomcats that received these new engines were designated F-14A+, and eventually became known as the F-14B. Aside from the new engines, the F-14B incorporated some avionics upgrades as well. Starting in 1991, a further upgraded version of the Tomcat, which featured a digital or glass cockpit, became known as the F-14D. The F-14D also incorporated the ability to carry lantern pods for precision ground strikes, and while doing so was known as the Bombcat. Easily one of the most recognizable features of the Tomcat are its variable geometry wings. These wings were designed so that the Tomcat could operate in a wide variety of flight regimes. As someone once said, there are planes that can fly faster or slower, but not both. The F-14's wings could be positioned for a 20-degree sweep for slow flight and as far back as 68 degrees for high-speed flight. A central data computer typically controlled the wing sweep, However, the pilot could manually override the system as needed. Additionally, the wings can be overswept to 75 degrees and overlap the horizontal stabilizers to save valuable space in a carrier. Interestingly, the fuselage of the F-14 can generate 40 to 60% of the total lift provided, depending on flight conditions and wing sweep. The F-14 was designed for and operated by the US Navy, which initially ordered 700 Tomcats. When that initial order was cut back to 300, Grumman tried to sell the Tomcat to foreign markets to recoup costs. The first and ultimately only export customer was Iran's Imperial Iranian Air Force, which chose the F-14 over the F-15 after a competitive show featuring both airplanes and weighing the pros and cons of each airframe. A quick side note, the Tomcat's iconic phrase, "Anytime baby," apparently was coined as a standing challenge for the F-15 Eagle. After Iran's Islamic Revolution occurred, exports of Tomcats were ceased as the new regime had allied itself with the Soviets. Interestingly, the F-14 was also offered to 3 other nations. The first of these was Canada, which was looking for a replacement of the F-101 Voodoo and went as far as to send officials to visit the Grumman plant. A deal looked to be in the works but fell through at the last moment. Canada instead went with the F-18 Hornet, which they still operate today. Japan had also expressed interest in the Tomcat, and like Iran had to decide between the F-14 and F-15. Although Grumman made great efforts to sell the Tomcat to the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, in the end, Japan chose the F-15, which they still operate to this day. And finally, then West Germany was approached to see if they would be interested in purchasing Tomcats for their Air Force. West Germany sent officials to tour the facilities at Grumman's production line, but a deal never materialized. It's not hard to imagine that if one or all 3 of these nations had adopted the F-14, it still may be operational today. Beginning in 1974, F-14s began replacing Navy F-4s, starting with squadrons VF-1 Wolfpack and VF-2 Bounty Hunters aboard the USS Enterprise. These initial Tomcat squadrons actually participated in the US withdrawal from Saigon during the final phases of the Vietnam War as part of Operation Frequent Wind. The F-14's first air-to-air victory came in 1981 when 2 VF-41 Black Aces Tomcats were engaged by 2 Libyan Su-22 fitters. The lead Su-22 fired an AA-2 ATOL missile, which missed. The F-14s then returned the favor by shooting down the 2 Su-22s with a couple of AIM-9 Sidewinder shots. In 1983, VF-11 and VF-31 F-14s flew combat air patrol over Lebanon in support of a multinational peacekeeping force. Both squadrons were engaged by anti-aircraft artillery and SAMs, but did not take any damage. Additionally, VF-11 engaged 8 MiGs, but the MiGs turned and fled before the missiles could be fired. In 1985, VF-74 and VF-103 operating from the USS Saratoga participated in a highly coordinated operation to divert an Egypt Air Boeing 737, which had terrorists on board. The terrorists had hijacked the Italian cruise liner Achille Lauro. 4 Tomcats performed the interception of the airliner while 3 flew top cover. The 4 intercepting Tomcats positioned themselves in front of, behind, and to either side of the 737, and then turned their position lights on. The 737 was diverted to a naval air station in Italy, where Navy SEAL teams surrounded the airliner and captured the terrorists. And once again off the Libyan coast, in 1989, Tomcats from VF-32 Swordsman were engaged by Libyan MiG-23s, which were armed with AA-7 Apex missiles. During an engagement that lasted 8 minutes, the Libyan MiG-23s kept turning towards the F-14s in order to maintain firing solutions on the Tomcats. After several iterations of this behavior, the MiG-23s were declared hostile and engaged. The result? One MiG-23 was shot down by an AIM-7 Sparrow and the other with an AIM-9 Sidewinder. The 2 Tomcats then returned to their carrier undamaged. Throughout the Tomcat's service life, an ongoing game known as Catch the Bomber was played. Soviet long-range bombers equipped with anti-ship missiles would approach carrier battle groups and would be greeted by F-14s waiting to intercept them. The Tomcat pilots would fly next to the bombers and escort them away from the battle group, and while the F-14s were flying alongside the bombers, the Tomcat crews would take photos and notes as to what weapons the bombers were carrying. During 1974 and 1975, the Shah of Iran ordered 80 F-14A Tomcats, delivery of which began in 1976 and continued to 1979. U.S. Navy pilots would pick up brand new Tomcats from the Grumman factory and fly them directly to Iran. Along with 79 Tomcats delivered, some 270 AIM-54 Phoenix missiles were also sent. The 80th and final F-14 was not delivered due to the Islamic Revolution and overthrow of the Shah. In 1980, Iraqi troops invaded Iran and kicked off the nearly decade-long Iran-Iraq War. The details are hard to confirm, but generally it is accepted that the Iranian F-14 shot down about 160 Iraqi planes while only losing 16, mostly due to accidents. During the course of the war, Iran depleted their supply of Phoenix missiles and began to use its F-14s as early warning platforms, with cover being provided by Iranian F-4s and F-5s. In 1991, 6 months after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Operation Desert Storm kicked off with a massive air campaign, the scale of which hadn't been seen since World War II. F-14s flew various missions during the course of the war, including combat air patrol, suppression of enemy air defenses, tactical air reconnaissance, fleet defense, and Scud strike support. MiG victories were not to be had, however, since apparently as soon as the Tomcats detected the Iraqi MiGs with their powerful radar, the MiGs will reverse course and flee. However, one air-to-air shootdown did occur when the commanding officer of VF-1 and his wingman came across an Mi-8 helicopter and shot it down with an AIM-9 Sidewinder. Additionally, one F-14 belonging to VF-103 was shot down. The pilot was rescued and the Rio was taken prisoner of war and released following the conclusion of the Gulf War. Following the Gulf War, the United Nations set up no-fly zones in northern and southern parts of Iraq. F-14s routinely patrolled these areas. Iraq would provoke the UN forces, and after several incidents, Operation Desert Fox was implemented, which called for strikes on Iraqi military targets. At the beginning of 1999, 4 U.S. Navy F-14Ds, along with 2 USAF F-15s, were engaged by some 13 Iraqi Mirage F-1s and MiGs. The F-14s and F-15s fired long-range missiles at the Iraqi fighters, but no hits were scored. When the war broke out in the nation that was once known as Yugoslavia, NATO forces were drawn in to initially fly reconnaissance and eventually combat missions. F-14s in this conflict flew a variety of missions including air-to-ground strikes and photo reconnaissance operations. It is important to note that this conflict was the first time F-14s dropped precision-guided munitions in actual combat. At the same time, the TARPS-equipped Tomcats presented the only manned photo reconnaissance platforms the US had in theater. During the Kosovo crisis of 1999, NATO conducted strikes against Serbian forces. Once again, F-14s dropped precision-guided bombs, with VF-14 delivering some 350 laser-guided bombs, while other sorties had the Top Hatters flying as forward air controllers for other NATO strike aircraft. Following the attacks on September 11th, retaliatory strikes were planned and conducted against Taliban targets in Afghanistan. During these, Tomcats from VF-14, VF-41, VF-102, VF-211, and VF-213 performed precision-guided strikes on various Taliban facilities and targets. During the 2003 invasion of Iraq, F-14s once again flew combat air patrols into Iraq and also participated in numerous air-to-ground strikes. By this time, the FA-18 Super Hornet was beginning to be deployed in larger and larger numbers, and the Tomcat's days were sadly numbered. Throughout the Tomcat's service life, Grumman looked for ways to upgrade the fighter and keep it on the cutting edge of technology. As early as 1987, when the F-14D Super Tomcat was being developed, Grumman was already working on the next generation of Tomcats. Most notably was the ST-21, or Super Tomcat 21st Century. ST-21 was to feature an upgraded GE FF-110-29 engine, which would have allowed the Tomcat to supercruise at Mach 1.3. Along with this, an upgraded radar, room for more fuel, improved control surfaces, and even potentially thrust-vectoring nozzles were planned. The ST-21 was Grumman's response to the Advanced Tactical Fighter, or ATF competition, which pitted the YF-22 against the YF-23. The Navy pulled out of the ATF program and ultimately went with the Super Hornet to fulfill most of its roles until the F-35 could be brought on board. Still, one has to wonder what could have been had the ST-21 been adopted with its super cruise and long-range ability. In 2006, the F-14 Tomcat was retired, officially having served 32 years to the day, from September 22, 1974 to September 22, 2006. There were several Tomcat flights following September 22nd, but these were mostly ferry flights. We may never see an aircraft like the Tomcat again. Iconic, beautiful, and unforgettable. Perhaps the F-14 can be summed up best in the words of a former Rio. The Super Hornet is a wonderful jet, and it's only going to get better. But it will never be cool. The Tomcat was cool. I know sexy when I see it. What do you think? Should the Tomcat have been developed into the ST-21? Does the Navy miss the range and power projection provided by the Tomcat? Let me know in the comments below.